Around 5 million years ago, the Gibraltar land bridge connecting Europe and Africa collapsed. Water rushed in and filled the Mediterranean. About 8,000 years ago, a tsunami from Norway battered the east coast of Britain and submerged the tract of land connecting it to Europe, forming the English Channel. The bit that was here is known as Doggerland. Around the same time, rising sea levels began the process of connecting the Atlantic Ocean to the Baltic Sea. And there it is, the modern contours of Europe as we would recognise it today. Lots of land and lots of coastline. Ideal conditions to encourage the development of trade routes and shipping, exploration and colonisation. A series of mountain ranges provide a natural barrier for the development of a distinct Mediterranean culture. Most of Europe is generally characterised by a temperate climate, with moderate levels of UV radiation favouring paler skin, which began to evolve over the last 8,000 years. For the 30 or so thousand years before that, Europeans were black. When these humans did first arrive in significant numbers, probably around 40,000 years ago, they encountered the earlier inhabitants of the continent, Neanderthals. The Neanderthals looked different from Homo sapiens but otherwise behaved very similarly. They made jewelry and used tools. They probably had clothing and buried their dead. They used fire for lighting and warmth, and cared for the disabled. They probably had bigger brains than us and likely had language, and, according to one BBC documentary at least, spoke in a high-pitched nasally voice.
They sounded like this.
Humans interbred with Neanderthals either violently through capture and rape, or consensually. We don't know. Modern humans of European and Asian origin have about 2% Neanderthal DNA. Those of African descent perhaps less than 1%. About 1,000 or so years after the arrival of humans, Neanderthals disappeared from the fossil record. Climate-wise, this period is characterised by rapid changes every 1,000 or so years from extremely cold to relatively warm. Arctic ice sheets expanded and retreated, at their largest extent covering the majority of the northern latitudes, the last of these beginning to retreat about 10,000 years ago. The humans that survived and eventually flourished in this environment, like the Neanderthals, used stone, flint and bone tools. They made clothes, buried their dead with ornaments, and made art. Small carved figurines and red ochre cave paintings. They hunted large and small animals, fished and gathered wild fruits. It took a further 1,000 years from the retreat of the last Arctic ice sheet for Europeans to begin to domesticate plants and cattle. In other words, to develop agriculture. This so-called Neolithic revolution originally began in the Middle East much earlier, and reached Greece around 7000 BC, and Britain 2,000 or so years later. Tools became more sophisticated, being ground and polished, and humans no longer at the complete mercy of migrating animals and Arctic ice began to spread throughout the continent and especially northwards. Sheep for wool, cows for milk, and oxen to pull stuff. Indeed, around the time that the early Britons were dragging those massive 25-ton stones along the wooded Neolithic landscape to build Stonehenge, they were evidently drinking so much animal milk that they eventually evolved the ability to actually digest it. In the 2000 BC, wheels appear in northern Europe, and, most importantly, so does the olive and grapevine in Greece. Greece changes significantly in this period. The population expands in the south, and regional centres of authority develop. There is the suggestion that societies are becoming more organised into hierarchies, with certain graves becoming unduly laden with expensive prestige goods. copper daggers begin to appear in graves. In fact, it was only for such ceremonial purposes that copper was used, it being relatively soft, no good for usable tools or weapons. Not until it was combined with tin to make bronze did metalworking revolutionize European culture and the landscape. The Bronze Age is characterized by the development of trading networks that facilitated the sale and transport of copper, found here, and tin, found here, to regional centres of manufacture. These networks drew Europeans together economically and culturally, and also brought them into conflict, as evidenced by the growth of large defensive centres and the invention of sword, shield and armour. Throughout the Bronze Age, the practice of burying important objects in the ground increased in frequency and scale. Tools, jewelry and weapons, either alongside humans during burial or by themselves, usually in or near water. Whatever religious, political or ritualistic significance this had is unclear. What was of great significance, however, was the appearance during the Bronze Age of Europe's first civilizations, the Minoan, centered in Crete, and later, the Mycenaean culture on the mainland, the details of which will be discussed in next week's video on the world of the Greeks. Whilst in the eastern Mediterranean these first European civilizations begin to appear, and thus the continent begins to make its unsteady transition from prehistory to history, elsewhere the facts remain, as ever, relatively blurry. Like the South, we can trace the development and adoption of new technologies and materials, most significantly now iron, and with it infer changes in the economic and cultural landscape. Most importantly, the transition to iron tools and weapons meant the neglect and breakdown of the old networks of trade and exchange that had been established during the Bronze Age. Unlike copper and tin, which for the most part were found in certain locations separated by vast distances, iron was abundant everywhere. Established contacts were broken, especially in the north, and the differentiation between it and the Mediterranean south grew. Trade did continue, but it became centred and dependent on commodities manufactured in the Mediterranean. This stratification was mimicked on the smaller scale throughout Europe, where differences between wealth and status hinted at in the late Neolithic are becoming firmly established both amongst individuals in graves, family and kinship groups in the size and function of different houses, and when comparing the relative wealth and poverty of entire settlements. It is during the Iron Age, then, that the characteristic character and structure of historic Europe is established. Thanks for listening. If you like this, subscribe and comment below.